This is a bit of rough reference for my this prop that I want up sculpting. So I'll talk a bit about some of the elements that maybe I would redo or how I might organize it. So for me, for sure, this sort of knocker piece here was separate, especially because I know I'd have to move. So when you're building something, I wouldn't necessarily dynamesh this together. I might insert or add a sphere, or sorry, a torus or a donut, but I wouldn't just dynamesh it right away. So, I also sort of sculpted out a very, very rough shape to begin with. And I'll sort of take you through. So everything was very, very rough, and I'll show you how I came to these pieces. And I realized too, sculpting it, that there were some other things I probably would have done differently, like this. This whole top piece, I think I would have probably sculpted separately just to kind of handle it in a better, more precise way. So this was just a very, very rough shape, and I sort of carved it out. And I'll show you some of the tools for that as well. So if I kind of load through, so I sort of ZRemeshed it right away, kind of not really sure what I was doing, but I dynameshed it. And I think I just want to bring a full scale resculpt. So some of these features, like the little claw feet here, which I think are here, I sort of made them a little bit more ornate, let's say, compared to the original. And again, these are blended directly into the head. I'll sort of talk, maybe just about building these pieces, and then maybe talk a little bit about the sculpting as well. So for something like that headpiece, it's actually kind of curved outwards a little bit from what I can tell. It looks like it's kind of rolled over. We can do sort of a few different deformations. So, and you can also start. There's no shame in actually kind of starting with a generic head, let's say, if the features are basically there. I'm not a huge fan of this. This is the default ZBrush head. Wait for that to load. It's got kind of odd proportions. It's stylized in a way, so it's kind of hyper exaggerated and a bit distorted. So if you go into Lightbox, that's your comma key. You do have that sort of generic face. You've got a couple of other sort of generic. Right, this one's not so bad, so you could actually isolate this. So if you notice, I'm actually hitting Shift F, which shows the wireframe and the polygroups. So this one's actually already organized into polygroups. So one advantage to that is that if you wanted to actually kind of delete away the parts, we can hold Control Shift Alt and basically remove the excess parts. So you could start with a mesh like this. For me, my preference is to almost always start with something. Oh, that's scary. I think I deleted the whole mesh by accident, but that's under Subtool, Delete. I should have gone to Geometry. I think I can undo that now. Modify and go to Delete Hidden. I could always reload the mesh though, so I can go back in and reload that same model. It'll bring it right back. So I would start by deleting some of these tools, let's say. So that's one option if you're building something like this, and then I would reshape it using the Move tool. So for me in my custom interface, I have Mesh Editing, Delete Hidden on the right side. In the default interface, which this is default on the right side, the left side is all my custom stuff. So it's here under Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. So that would delete the hidden mesh that's no longer there. So then we could probably just delete the skull. We don't need that. So these are separate subtools. These are very common. So you'd often have like separate eyeballs, maybe a base or whatever. So the subtools are a way to kind of keep the project together, but still be able to organize things separately. I think I have to sort of isolate these. So I usually go into Solo quite a bit. So there's like the cornea bulge in here, and then I probably don't need the irises and all that detail, but I might actually. I'll probably delete that and go with the other ones instead. So I'll turn off Solo, make sure the visibility's on. Right, so you can actually use this mesh and essentially, use the Move tool around and kind of open and close. I'm hitting X, by the way, to work in symmetry. But for me, like I said, I'd probably just sculpt that head. I'm going to go back here. So for me, the sculpting is pretty straightforward. And if you're sculpting from reference too, one of the great things you can do in ZBrush. So if I were starting from scratch, so let's say we start with a sphere, make polymesh, you can actually go into see-through mode. And then we can actually try sculpting and carving this tool via that. So once you hover back to the outer top edge of the interface, you can turn that see-through mode back to 0, but there's the see-through slider. So it's really, really great way to kind of access your references. So yeah, let me full scale, and then you can probably zoom into this guy, you know. So I would kind of follow the angle approximately, go through see-through, and then try to kind of rough out the proportions. So yeah, using move brush, get the chin down. Again, I'd want to be in symmetry. I usually almost always start and stay inside of symmetry. So I'm going to pull those in for the outer edges. Usually for a face, you know, we have kind of a protrusion of the nose. So I can go back off of see-through. And you can use, there's a whole bunch of reference sort of tools out there. Pull the chin forward. Pull it wider. And so, yeah, for me, this, I also know I'm going to slice off the back half of the head. I'm not modeling a full head. It's very like shallow. It's a relief sculpture. So it's maybe not as shallow as a relief sculpture. So if you ever want to slice something, I usually recommend going into Dynamesh. By the way, also on the right side here, I've kind of condensed it so it's a little bit easier. So you can go Dynamesh right away. Usually your default resolution is fine as a starting point. It's not too low, it's not too high, so it's not overly complex, and we can still kind of, you know, holding shift. I should mention this, as you go higher in resolution, whether through Dynamesh or through the division levels, it will be harder. The smoothing brush becomes less effective, so that's something to make note of. So remember I mentioned if you hold Control Shift and left click and drag, it allows you to kind of isolate the visibility, or Control Shift Alt will allow you to hide the visibility of one part of the mesh or the other. And Control Shift clicking will kind of flip that around. Control Shift click off will make it visible. This is one of the situations I mentioned earlier where you want to actually slice or cut the back half of this model off. So I'm going to turn off perspective. So what I'm going to do is go in, there's a few different trim and slicing curves. So yeah, just to go over it one more time, Control Shift click and drag off the model and over it will allow you to isolate the visibility of this part. Control Shift click off the model will unhide everything. Control Shift click on the visible part will make it invisible and make the other part visible, and vice versa. So we can kind of go back and forth by doing that. So that's when you hold Control Shift, it is activating what's called selection brushes. And if you notice in here, if I click on that brush in the upper left corner, you actually have selection lasso, which is usually my preference over the rectangle. You have something called clip curve, slice curve, and trim curve. These are the primary brushes within this category of selection brushes. So they're selection and slicing brushes. I have them down here as shortcut icons. So it'll warn you too. So I'm going to show you the difference between the three. So the first one is clip curve. When you click on this, it'll say, hey, this brush will be your active selection brush when you hold Control Shift. So I'll say, okay. So what happens? If I Control Shift click and drag, you're going to notice a shaded line. Right? So it's going to be like a dotted line with shading to one side. So what that means is the shading on the one side is going to collapse the mesh down. It'll flatten it in that direction. Now you can sort of see it's actually not cutting it, it's just flattening towards that line. So I did the same thing here. You have to keep in mind too, this is a bit weird. So when you go bottom to top, the shading's on the left side. If you go top to bottom, the shading's on the right side. If you go right to left, the shading's below. If you go left to right, the shading's above. And like I said, it's not actually removing it. So if you see the nose here, right, it's actually just going to flatten that nose down against that curve. So that's, again, holding Control Shift. I'm not sure why. Yeah, Control Shift. There we go. And you can let go of Control Shift. And if you hit Alt once, you can actually create a curve, which is pretty cool, right? So you can hit Alt, creates a curve. If you hit Alt twice, it can create a sharp edge. a sharp angle. And then when you let go, it's just going to flatten that mesh against that. Now, it's usually at this point I would just hold Control, click, and drag while in Dynamesh mode, remember, right? So that's going to remesh and redistribute the polys. Now, I don't want to do that in this case, but I do want to use, something like Clip Curve. But I'm going to show you the two other alternate brushes. So, like I said, Clip Curve is okay, but sometimes it can get messy, right? So if I Clip Curve, let's say down here, it flattens it, but you see it actually left behind this excess. So there are situations where you may want to do something different. There's a slight deviation in these two. There's something called trim. So I'll show you what trim does. So when I hold Control Shift and drag across, trim actually cuts away that mesh and then fills it in with some automated tessellated mesh. So I think in a situation like this where I just kind of want the front part of the face, that would probably be the best option so I don't get any weird leftover mesh from the Clip Curve. Right? So when I do it this way, or if I do it far enough forward on the face, right, you'd see I get this kind of halo, which if I Dynamesh this, it can get very messy. So Clip Curve is great in many situations, but not all situations. So this is where I might say trim is better. All right, so trim would actually just literally get rid of stuff on the shaded side of the line and just automatically fill this in with a poly group. So I would say that's an advantage to trim over Clip Curve in this case. And just to show you one last variation, there's slice. So slice actually cuts through, creates an edge. So it actually, keeps two parts and polygroups them. So you could actually split these into two separate subtools. All right, so I could go split two parts. And it's going to recognize the polygroups, the two different color-coded regions as two different parts. Group split, I should say, group split. And you'll see the front half is its own tool and the back half is its own tool. But I think in this case, the best choice was the trim curve. So in this case, I can also just delete the back half. And you can also go into, under my custom interface, you can go to mesh editing and say close holes, and that fills in that hole. So that's kind of what the trim curve is, like an extra step above slice. So it slices it, deletes the back half, and then does a fill. By the way, in the regular interface that is available, the fill is under modified topology. Just where delete hidden is, there's a bit further down. So delete hidden is here, and then close holes is just right over there under modified topology, geometry. Yeah, in terms of sculpting though, I think we just kind of want to eyeball things. So I use clay tubes a lot, clay buildup, clay tubes. If you notice, like I said, I've got custom numbers on each of these brushes. So these are my most used brushes, like 9 is the lasso, 0 is Clip Curve, 7 is inflate, 6 is snake hook, 4 and 5 are clay tubes. Clay tubes is basically, I'll just show you without the see-through on for a second. So as you go, right, I keep brushing back and forth. It hits a level. If I let go and brush again, it's going to hit a level. Okay, so it just kind of builds to a certain level. Now, when you're sculpting early on, though, clay buildup is a little more useful. So what happens is if you sculpt and then come back and forth, it builds up really, really quickly. So that's why it's called buildup. The stroke, as it goes over itself, keeps multiplying the stroke. So yeah, it's kind of on an odd angle. So just again, focusing on big forms, I'm going to hold Alt and sort of sculpt in the eye socket. I usually, this is more sculptural. If it were a production mesh, I'd probably, like build an actual separate nose and everything. I'll show you a little technique for the mouth in a minute. Yeah, maybe I should start a YouTube channel for that, visual ASMR. So if you take a look, right, I've just very quickly sculpted out or sketched out this. So I think, I probably had some other reference. I probably need a bit more reference as well, but I'm going to just, smooth this out. All right, so this is a vague impression. So for the lips, I can kind of go over that again with just a basic sphere. My trick is this, and it's very, very simple. Right? Brush, I almost draw like a big mustache, smooth to the top a little bit. I should probably divide the mesh a bit more just so we can sort of see that a bit better. So brush, right, kind of build up this upper shape. And then you want a lesser amount of that because usually the lips are underhanging the upper. That's a little too plump, so I'm going to just dial that back. And then, so this is a little, yeah, it's very fish lip right now. But if I hold, I'm going to go to dam standard. So dam standard is like a crease brush, right? So it kind of like digs in a deep gouge. Yes, it's a very sensual sphere. Okay, and then usually at a lower amount, just to kind of create a temporary lip line, right? Then we can kind of get that in and do a little bit of just very gentle softening there. So we can kind of like sketch out, right? And we can also kind of dig in here and do a little clay. But that's, you know, just a kind of quick, right? Kind of quick example of some lips. Okay. So it's very, very, you know, it can be very, very fast. Yeah. So now this guy is obviously not as luscious, and he's got, you know, kind of stylized lips. He's got really ugly teeth. So when I initially sculpted this, I did sculpt the mustache separately, and I probably might still do it the same way. But ultimately, when I make a normal map out of this, I kind of wanted this, at least the head itself, to be one complete piece. But when you start, you know, sometimes I find it's easier to control rather than dynameshing teeth in. I would do them separately. So I'll kind of ignore the sculpt on this for now. Or here, I'll show you a couple things. Let's go to brush insert. So you could do a brush insert, for example, and just do a simple sphere. So grab a sphere, and we can do this in symmetry, right? And if you hold shift, it'll keep it sort of aligned forward. One thing you have to be careful of, though, is if you let go or if you drag up, it'll do this weird thing where it makes them very pointed. So you want to just drag straight down, so it doesn't do kind of weird pointy eyeballs, and then we can just kind of drag these back and in. So that can be, you know, a helpful sort of start to your sculpt. The other thing too is, like, while you have this kind of inverted mask, by the way, they're different polygroups, so you can mask them very easily again. But sometimes I'll then say, okay, let's take my clay tubes, flip my mask around, and now I can kind of like sculpt around here to kind of get more of the bridge of the nose, right? Get that shape going. Okay, let me dig this in a little further. Bring these cheeks out more. So it's all kind of like very foundational sort of work right now. Okay. Oh, by the way, sometimes if you're sculpting and you have thin mesh like this, I could just delete this back polygon, but when you sculpt through, ZBrush is what's known as a projection-based sculpting system. So that means it'll literally project sometimes from the front side to the back side of the model. So let me crank the intensity. Not quite catching it, but let's say I do it here. You'll see it almost go through that side. I do have an option in my, I think it's right near the top here, actually, called double. So you can, sorry, not double, back face mask. Back face mask will prevent you from accidentally sculpting front to back. Yeah, like the other thing too is I'm noticing the face. By the way, I'm hitting W, E, or R, which is W, E, R is like the rotation tool, scale, move, rotate. If you hold Alt and you hit this little circular arrow, this will reset the pivot, and then you can, while holding Alt, you can freely move the pivot around in your scene. And so if I feel like the face is sort of sticking out too much, I can kind of scale it back and down a bit, you know. And let me control click and flip around the mask, and then I can sort of pull those eyeballs back to fit proportionally. Now, if I Dynamesh, by the way, I've cleared my mask, and remember, Dynamesh is still on. You can see it on the left side. When I Dynamesh, that will merge it together. So, you know, you could have also just done a quick sculpt of that as well. You know, for screaming, you know, you can do one of a couple things, like the mouth is open. It's not really screaming, but I could sort of sculpt a lip here temporarily and then hold Alt to dig in the mouth, basically. So it's going to hold that piece. So again, Dynameshing as I go because I want to create the opening. Okay. So I'm, again, just kind of fleshing out a lot of preliminary shapes. Yeah, it's okay. So yeah, we can get a bit more into sculpting later on. I just sort of want to move on to, all right, sort of breaking down. So let's say if I wanted to do the mustache, again, I might keep it sort of as a separate subtool, a floating piece, but I might start it. I'll go to B for brush, I for insert. I'll go to insert mesh, and then I'll drag out a sphere. I'll try it again. I'm going to drag it out, but I want to split it. So remember, if I want to keep it as a separate subtool, I'm going to say split split unmasked point. So those little spheres will be separated off. I want to make sure my visibility's on. Separate. These spheres are a separate subtool. They have Dynamesh on, which is good. So what I can do with these is I'm going to hit, this is just like Maya, WER. It activates basically the same tool, and I'm going to hold Alt, which will reset the pivot, and then I can kind of squish them a little bit flatter. So that's one thing. And I have Dynamesh on, so I'm going to basically try something like Snake Hook to get the mustache down. And I can try to push it back like this, and I'll just Dynamesh, and that kind of evens out the shape of that. So I do want it to, because eventually I want this thing to kind of be baked out almost as one piece, the mustache and the face. So I do want the mustache basically touching the face. So for the ring, I think I'll probably just start this. So I want you to keep this in mind. In ZBrush, this is basically your palette up here. This is the tool palette. So essentially this bigger square is the thing that's keeping the active brush alive. And I highly recommend doing a save as often and numbering it. So I usually do this a lot. I'll go to save as. All right, I save it where I'm working. In this case, I just want to, since it's a demo, I'm just going to dump it in here. I'll call it knocker_01. Always a good idea. And then when you want to load it, you just go to load tool, and you can load the Z tool again. Okay. That's a very important aspect of the project. So I want to start working on the ring part of the knocker. So this is where I think, organizing things into subtools is really, really useful, really important. So I'm going to take, I'm going to take this and go into ring. So this is just a default ring. So this becomes the active tool. Okay. To get back to the mustache here, I'd have to go back here, right, to that tool. So you can sort of see that. And because this ring is, I haven't clicked on make polymesh. So what this allows you to do is actually go in and say, you know what, I want the radius to be a little bit thinner. Okay. You can adjust. If I hit Shift F, we can see the wireframe of it. So I maybe want less polys to start. And remember, we do want to get this to a low poly object at some point. So I would say it might be a good idea to plan for this. So I might have I don't know, maybe like 32 divisions instead of 64, and then I'll have maybe 12 divisions instead of 16. So that's 384 polys. It's not a ton, but it's not a little either. Now this is. I'm going to click make polymesh. So it's going to make a PM3D polymesh 3D ring. And what I can do is go into this tool, and I'm going to go to subtool, and then go to append. And then here, I'll just zoom back out a bit. I can click on that mesh. So it's going to add that ring. Yeah, just a question there, like, can you do it with an insert? Absolutely, you can, but I feel like sometimes I get more control with the, by going into the actual tool and then going down to its, it goes away, or it changes, but there's an initializer where I can change the thickness and dial it in with how many polygons. So I find that is a little bit more controlled, basically. Now, if you notice, now I might save this for later on, but you see the one end is a little bit thicker, I think, than the upper end. I'll show you a little trick to this. Remember masking, our old friend here. So we can actually control, click, and drag to mask about half of this thing. And remember, if you control click on this once, twice, maybe 3 times, it blurs the masking. And if I control click again to flip the masking, what I can do here, this is a panel I use a fair bit. So some of these brushes, we have an inflate brush, so I can brush in and scale this up, but you can actually just apply it to a whole subtool or a whole unmasked area. So I can actually go in and inflate that. So you see how it actually tapers the thickness. So that's one kind of really interesting trick that you can kind of play with. So maybe I'll control tap it a lot, so it really fades in nicely. Right, so we kind of get, maybe I'll just mask a bit more of that top part, and then blend it again and inflate, right? So we can get a tapering effect towards that end. So that's a really, really powerful way to work too, is to kind of mask certain areas, and then you can use deformation or just straight up sculpting brushes to alter a shape. Now, the only reason I might want to wait on this is because, you know what, I want to put grooves into this thing. I want to maybe put the decoration on. So I think I'm going to keep it even and save that for a change at the very end. But for now, I just want to show you that, you know, this is how we can start to organize our tool, right? We can sort of keep things separate. We don't have to Dynamesh things right away into one solid mass, because it may not always make sense to do that. You know, if you have a book and there's carvings in the book, then it might be okay, you know, to just carve it straight into the main part of the mesh. Or if there's like a decorative buckle or something, depending on if you want it to move or not, you can kind of keep it separate or combined. The other thing is, you know, this palette, it keeps loading other models that you open into this palette, and that can get very heavy. It can actually eat up a lot of RAM. So if you have limited amount of RAM on your computer, you may want to just make sure you save your mesh first. Very important. So I might just say, okay, this is like version 2, save. And then I'll hit reset. So it'll actually kind of dump out the rest of those opened tools in the memory, and then you're free to keep working. And so again, you know, this is all very much blocking. I haven't really set the shape up for this yet. I haven't sculpted it, but you know, I may just decide, okay, I can use the inflate brush instead of the inflate tool and say, okay, I'm going to inflate kind of in this direction and Dynamesh it again. Okay, and then for some of the details, I might say, okay, let's go in. I'm going to take a small, and I'm going to take the intensity. I often adjust a lot, so you'll see me hit U for intensity and S for brush size. So those are my quick. These are default shortcuts, but I use them a ton. So, you know, you can come in and start to sort of sculpt a little bit of that hair, sense of that hair. Now the resolution's a little bit limited on that mustache. So when you have separate subtools, just to let you know, one piece of mesh could be clean, like this cylinder, right? It's not Dynamesh. Dynamesh isn't on in any way, but the mustache is Dynameshed. It's got its own resolution. The face is Dynameshed. It could have its own Dynamesh resolution, right? So each tool kind of has its own polygon type, you could say. That it could be divided mesh with divisions and layers. One could be Dynamesh, one could be Sculptress. So you don't have to kind of stick to just one method purely in the software. So yeah, maybe I'll kind of pull out some of this, get a bit more shape in it, right? And then I would up the resolution a bit, because I feel like I need that support in the model to get some of those little, you know, wispy hair details. Right, so I kind of carve in some of this here. So I'm just using damn standard. Now, not the best sculpting right now, but I can always come back to that. I just want to show the next part, which is kind of this funny little hat thing, and maybe even this little circular base. So again, we can use sort of a mixture of techniques. This one I might try to, yeah, I'll see if I can use maybe Booleans. So I might even build this almost like a separate tool. So I'll show you how that might work. So what I could do is start with a cylinder. And let's take a look at this thing. So yeah, it's almost like a half cylinder here, right? And then I know from another angle, it's kind of like angled. So I'll show you some interesting tricks. So inside a ZBrush, okay, so first I can maybe scale this thing down. Okay, so it's a bit smaller. If I hold Control and, oops, I gotta make polymesh so I can actually start actively editing this. So if I hold Control, I can drag a copy of that mesh very quickly. I'm going to just drag this out like so. All right, so you guys sort of see what I'm going for, I hope. This little notch cut out at the top. Now I do need to separate this, so I'm going to show you this. This is another way. This is a little bit different. It's not Dynamesh, it's not Z-remeshing, it's Booleans. Now you've probably been told before Boolean's bad, which usually I would say is the case. But what I'm going to do with this is, first of all, I'm going to go to split, because remember, when you click and drag, or click and move, click and scale a subtool, it actually creates a clone of that tool. And so it's almost acting a bit like an insert in a way. So I do want to split unmask points. And just to zoom in a little bit, we have some buttons over here. So these are actually meant to act as Boolean So this, if you click on this downward arrow, this is the start of your Boolean, and then you could subtract or have the overlapping piece be the result of that. So I'm going to zoom out, and then we can sort of see. I believe I have this under, I've been messing around with this lately. Under mesh editing, there's live Boolean. And so if I turn this on and I set it to subtract, you will now see it subtract in real time. And if you hit Shift F on that subtool, you can now actually interactively place it, adjust it, and then turn it off with Shift F. So Shift F is that wireframe display. Yeah, just a question about resolution. Like, there's no resolution limit on this part of the assignment, but for what I do, I tend to kind of only go as far as I need to. So for this face, you see it's very blocky still, but I'm still early on in figuring out the shapes. So I can slowly up the resolution slider over here as I go. Yeah, and with the ring, I don't have any details yet, but I might divide it because, I can probably keep this basic shape for the low res part of things later on, but I can certainly divide it and go up and add resolution to that. So yeah, those are things that you can consider when you're sculpting. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, what was I doing? Cylinder Boolean, right? So got the Boolean, live Boolean. So this is like its own tool, right? It's almost like its own project. The other one's still technically open sitting over there, but this one is sort of a separate thing. So I'm doing that, right? Now, technically, this is kind of an arced thing, so I'm not going to totally slice it off, and it looks like it kind of comes down and below, but so yeah, let's say I'm okay with that. And yeah, so we could do a couple of things. I'm going to just make this a mesh. So basically, in the subtool palette, there is a Boolean section, and it's very simple. There's just basically a button called Make Boolean Mesh. And you'll notice up here, it's going to make another mesh. So when I click on that mesh, it's going to actually create a U mesh. So again, ZBrush does this. It's a little weird, but it creates a thing. So now it's actually a solid piece of mesh, right? So you can see all the Boolean lines and where the resolution is different. It's got all these connecting edges and triangles. So what I can probably do is just try to Dynamesh it right away. The results aren't terrible. Yeah, they're okay. I might even wait for this for a second. Now, the one feature I was saying is that this is on a slope. I can sort of see it here. So it's kind of thicker at the top and thinner at the bottom. So what can I do for this? Well, remember our friend, slice curve. I'm going to slice like so. And by the way, if you like the angle that you're on, I mentioned something else, but this too, slice curve or trim. I'll try trim, actually. Is trim going to do it? Yeah, trim will do it pretty well. So there's a couple of weird things about this brush. If you hold Control Shift, you see it sort of snaps in 5-degree increments, but if you let go of Control and Shift, it's now active. And let's say you like this angle, but it's maybe not quite in the right spot. Well, what you can do is hold the space bar and move the whole curve. So I can do that. So that applies too. Like even if you have a weird curve with a bunch of shapes and whatever, right? You can actually, let me redraw the curve again, just so you can see it. If I hold spacebar, I can move that whole curve somewhere else. It's just a move option, but in this case, I'm doing a very, very simple line, like so. Now this is a little bit messy. You can sort of see it's gotten a little nasty, so I might actually decide to Dynamesh. And if I want to keep the edges a little bit sharper, you probably do need a little bit more resolution. So I'm going to just Dynamesh a little bit higher, so it's keeping things pretty crisp. I can also try to increase blur and do what's called a polish. So what that's going to do is kind of soften out those edges. But I think in this case, I'm just fine with it the way it is for now. I'm going to leave it like so. So yeah, I'll try that trim brush. There. And I'm not getting a weird lip from that right now, just because there's a bit more resolution for the mesh to support. So that's not too bad, right? I'm getting that shape pretty quickly, pretty clearly. And let me just see something. I do want to check my symmetry, right? So my symmetry is basically still at the center, I believe, of that old cylinder. Now, here's where things get a little wild. Are you guys ready? Let's go to brush. No, not brush. Let's go to transform. So we have symmetry, right? So if I just go into Dam Standard and sculpt, right? going to make it a little deeper so we can see it a little better, right? I've got X, Y. If you go to transform is basically where you can adjust your pivot point. But down here, there's something called symmetry. If I go to R for radial symmetry, I now have a ring of brush strokes, but it's going on the X axis. So it's actually going this way. And I need to change that. So you can change your symmetry axis to Y or Z. In this case, Y works for me. So now I can try to get those brush strokes in. Now I think what I should have done, you realize I have a bit of a problem here, right? And that because of this angle, it's actually kind of fading a little bit. So what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to undo back to this stage, pre-slice. So again, sometimes, you have to get stuck in a corner and then you realize I got to go back a couple steps and attack it a different way. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this patterning in first and then change the angle. I'm not going to slice or trim it because that'll cut it away. But remember, clip curve will just flatten it against itself. So I'll do a really, really quick test. I'm going to Dynamesh this at a little bit higher resolution like this. And then if I do just a stroke, right, very simple stroke. Not a great stroke, but it's there. Okay. That's okay for now. And then remember, instead of trim, I'm going to do clip. I'm going to see if clip works. And again, I have to turn off my symmetry. I'll just turn off symmetry. And in theory, will that work? Oh, but then I lose that. Okay, well, I'll figure something else out. There's always an option, always a way around it. So I guess I'll go back. I'll go back to trim. So yeah, a lot of times I like to try to figure out like what is the simplest, easiest move and what's going to give me the best result. Yeah, so that's kind of an issue, right? Is that it's sort of not. So I've got a few options. I can try to, maybe move this up and then try to like angle it a bit, but I don't think I'm going to do that. One other thing we can do. So interestingly enough, let's see how many things we have here. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we got 9 actually in total. If you go to transform, you can actually change the radial count. So I can change this to like, so I had about 10 on one side. So I probably need like 20, 24 or something like that. 24. So now I get 24 brush strokes, right? And I think, again, I need more resolution. So I'm going to just up the resolution. Yeah, so I can try this. I think maybe I have too many now, so I'm going to just drop this down a bit. So I upped my Dynamesh, just to let you guys know, I upped my Dynamesh resolution to help support the sculpting a bit. And I want to just, let's see if I can, it's actually still way too many. So I'll, sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error, but so there are a few other options. I can try a few different things. It's funny because I think when I did it the other way, I just hand sculpted each one individually. So you could do this where you kind of like, try to trace over, but again, it's still a little bit messy. So I do want to point out something else to you, is that if you go into drag, remember, I think I mentioned this in the last class, if you have something like an alpha here, let's say this alpha, right, it kind of drags it around. Ooh. Let me turn off that symmetry stuff for a sec. I'll set it kind of back to its default and then just turn it off. So if you drag out an alpha, right, we can actually, using lazy mouse and turning up lazy step, we can actually create separated individual textures. So I think one of my ideas might be to try to come around here, right, to create that shape. So I'm going to just do a really kind of simple trick here. I'm going to, let's see. Do I have in primitives? I don't think I have a pill box in here. I don't remember if I do or not. Yeah, I'll take a simple sphere. That'll be probably fine. Okay, I'll make Polymesh 3D. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to ZModeler. So that's the ZBrush modeling tool. I'm going to hover just over the dead center line. And I'm going to bevel it just a tiny amount. So I'll take that center line and just bevel it a little bit. Oops, come on. I'm not sure why it doesn't want to bevel, but let's see. There. Okay, so I got a little bevel. And what I'm going to do is isolate this, and I'm going to go into this. I have a little tool called auto groups. This is in the default. So where did I put it now? Mesh editing or subtool organization, I think. Okay. Auto groups. So what that's going to do is when there's a gap between two pieces of mesh in terms of visibility, so I just hit the middle polygroup, I hit auto groups. That, by the way, if you're looking for it in a regular interface, is just on the right side under polygroups, auto groups. And so now I've got 3 groups. Now you might wonder, why the heck are you doing that? Well, I want to make just a simple pill shape, which is kind of what this is, right? It's like a little pill shape. So if I hit the move tool, there's a really interesting function with polygroups and the move scale rotate tool that if you control click on any group, it will mask all the other non-selected groups. And I'm going to hold Alt to reset the axis, and now I can make my little pill shape. So it's a very kind of quick editing technique. And I'll clear the mask. So this will get into some other interesting areas. Okay, so one thing I do want to look at too is that you can sort of see, right, these polygon faces are not totally smooth. So I might just hit Control D once, twice, maybe 3 times to get it looking a little bit smoother overall, okay? So this for me is pretty much okay. And there's a really cool trick. So I'm going to make sure perspective is off. I'm going to kind of rotate around. And what I can do with this is really awesome. I'm going to go into the alpha menu. And I can say, I want to create an alpha from this mesh. And you can see it's actually going to create like a little shaded alpha texture based on that model. So I'm going to just hold Alt to try to frame it, or you can hit F to frame and then maybe zoom out, because I usually like to give it a little protected space in here. Max out my resolution at 2K. I hope in the newer version they've increased this to like 4K, 8K, and I'll say OK. So you see I got a little alpha. So I can just keep that aside for now, and then let's go back to this thing. All right, remember this guy. Back to standard. I'm on stroke. I have those settings from this other brush. Load this alpha. Not quite the right direction. So in alpha, I can go in and say, let's rotate it horizontally. And now I can get, right, basically those strokes if I wanted to try to draw it across. Maybe I'll do it in symmetry, you know. So that's kind of a workaround. By the way, the stroke is kind of fading out at the edges, because remember this, there's a focal shift. So I set this down to maybe -100. That will draw it out pretty well. So maybe a little bit bigger. A little bit bigger. And I'm going to adjust the step size down a bit. So that's getting closer. All right, so if one way doesn't work, you try another, right? So I'm going to go maybe, by the way, this lazy mouse, if I want to, I have such a horrible brush stroke, right? It's not even, and I'm using a mouse. So I'm going to turn up maybe a bit of lazy smooth and lazy radius. And if I hold Alt, it's going to actually drag it in. So that's a good way to kind of get that shape in there. Okay, so that's sort of one way you can go about tackling something like that. And if you take a look, there's some other features, like it's maybe protected along the border, so I could always try to maybe just mask out, right? Mask out an edge. Doing this very roughly, but you kind of get the idea. You can actually control click on the mask to blur it, and then control alt click on it to sharpen it as well. But anyways, let's try. Yeah, let's try and hold alt. Yeah, I'm not quite getting the arc I want, but I can come pretty close. Now, the other thing I might do, just because, the sides of this mesh look very faceted, that's sometimes from just Dynameshing right away when the mesh is really low res. So I might actually temporarily turn off Dynamesh to fix this issue to get maybe a bit better, cleaner mesh. I may even just do a trim slice off the bottom here, because I don't really want that piece anymore, so I can cut that away. And then just very quickly do a Z remesh. I'll say keep groups. Z-remesh. By the way, the higher the resolution of the mesh when you remesh, the longer it can kind of take and the slower it can be. So sometimes I just temporarily dynamesh. With a shape this simple, I can dynamesh it down really, really low. And in this case, I also want to, yeah, let me see. You know, it's still kind of looking sharp there, so I'm going to just maybe go in half. You can also pick half as a poly count. So I can keep going in half until it kind of gets a little bit smoother looking. And yeah, I might just slice off the back as well. Now I can keep the poly count the same and re-dynamesh that. By the way, like slicing kind of created some artifacts, right? Because it created this weird little lip. One workaround for that is that you can also, another way to make polygroups is actually just to, instead of using the slice and trim and all that, you can actually use a selection. So I'm going to just try to very quickly, finally use a selection like this, hit Control W, makes a new group. So you can do it based on visibility, based on masking. Right. And then if I need to maybe clean some of this up, I can try to go down to deformation, try polish by group. Polish by group, right? And it kind of cleans it up a little bit nicer. So now I could actually go back to even something more traditional. So let's say yeah, I'm going to go into divide a few times, right? So it gives me a nice appealing shape there. And then I can, again, I need a bit more resolution. You can sort of tell. Sometimes, you know, if you have an alpha and you drag it in, you're like, it's kind of jagged looking. Well, that could be the surface or the resolution of this texture. In this case, I know it's the resolution of the mesh, so I'm going to divide it up again. And it's a little bit better this time around. So yeah, this lazy mesh smooth and radius, it's basically to help kind of average out your brush stroke and make the arc a little more appealing, let's say, or fluid. Okay, so I'm going to just do something like that. Okay, so that's, again, it's its own floating piece. I can come back to this part here. So you can keep them organized, and at some point, like I said, that little headpiece and the face and the mustache, I could kind of dynamesh them all together later on. So I'm going to go to Append and bring in, I believe, which one is it? This one. And then I'm going to just make sure I switch to that piece. I can rotate and drag, and then we can kind of bring that up and over here and scale it hopefully to the right kind of proportions. That's roughly where it should be. You know, the great thing is, you know, you can always take a move brush and let's just hit X or in symmetry, right? You can kind of drag and pull things in and around. You can kind of warp the shape if it needs to fit better. So you're never, you know, kind of fully stuck with a piece of mesh the way it is. You know, you can always adapt and change it. And I can, yeah, I might just go back to trim, you know, to sort of slice off because I don't really need that depth. Now this is telling me to freeze the mesh. Remember I mentioned freezing because it has subdivision layers. Instead of me freezing, because I ultimately plan to dynamesh this anyways, I can just delete lower and then slice this back half off. All right, so I can kind of get roughly the same depth there. Yeah, so that's, you know, and I can basically keep going in the same way. So for example, if I do something like the little cylinder at the bottom there, right, I can start with another cylinder. I'm going to show you another little trick here with polygroups. If you go to, sorry, I have to go to make polymesh, and then I'm going to go down into polygroups. You can actually do groups based on normals. So it's sort of like the crease based on an angle. So anything over 45 degrees will be created in a new group. So if I hit polygroup, the top is a group, bottom is a group, and the side's a group. So now if I go to something like the, let's say Z Modeler, if I hold space, I'm going to go to Insert, Single Loop. Now I can insert a loop there. And I know this thing, I think there's like a, where is it? It's a little bit hard to see, but there's like a a flat section, then a raised section, then another flat section. So I'm going to go to, by the way, with the Z modeler active, if you hold Alt, you can paint this in and make this like a temporary polygroup. So I could say, hey, let's go in and I'm going to maybe extrude that. Oops, make sure you hover over a polygon. Sometimes I'll make the brush lower. There we go. And then I can take this. I can say I want to scale. Now right now it's a single poly, but I want to scale a whole polygroup. And this is its own polygroup. So I can scale this down and in. Now for simplicity too, I may often go in and remove certain loops. Like these side loops don't add any detail to the mesh at all. So I'm going to go and delete complete loops. So I can, I can go through and delete these. So I'll take those out. For these, I can say maybe I'll inset a single loop. I'll go polygroup all because this is one polygroup, so I might want to inset all of these to have their own little individual faces. And then I'm going to, I guess, extrude them in a bit. Oops, and I should do polygroup all, right? So now I can extrude those inwards. Right, because I think there's a few of those. And I've got a lot of them in here, but this is just an example of what we can do. Now if we divide, right, it's pretty awful. So remember, I set up polygroup specifically for this reason. So I can go into creasing. So that would be under geometry, crease. I can say crease polygroup, and I'm going to set the level down to like, I don't know, 3 or 4, let's say. I'll go crease polygroup. And then I'll try maybe the bevel. Let's see what beveling does. I may just leave without bevel, but I'm going to try to divide a few times to see what happens there. Not bad, but not great either. So depending on the scenario, I may just, instead of creasing, I may just bevel individual edges to kind of round them out a bit. So I might just go to bevel and click on this. And by the way, you can actually, if you're holding space, so if I'm hovering over this bevel, edge loop complete, and you can say 2 rows, 4 rows, and right now it's a linear edge. So what that means is if you bevel, you see it's just flat, but if you go in here, you can go soft edge, and it'll, kind of round it out. So when you divide this, or if you do decide to divide it, it'll kind of keep it a bit rounder. Let's see. Oops. Set that to 0. Let's try that out and see. That's not too bad. Okay, so and maybe as a last piece, there's I think a few little kind of decorative dots on there. So right now this thing has no divisions. If I had divisions, then I would have to do some more controlled creasing and things like that to get rid of some of these weird shapes. But let's just say, I don't have anything to freeze. I can go to brush, I can go to insert, and then I can take a simple primitive and I can take a sphere, all right, and I can insert it on this mesh. Well, what else can we do? We can go to transform, symmetry, remember, make it radial. And I think in this case, Y is the best. And if you take a look, right, I can drop in essentially those little dots. So if I go to transform, I don't know how many there are, but I think there's quite a few. So maybe like 16. Right. It's probably a bit more than that. Might even be double that. So I'm going to undo that. Transform, set it to 32. By the way, if you take a look here, this is a depth setting for insert brushes. And I know these basically appear like half spheres, squashed half spheres. So if I take this and set it down to about here, it'll sit so much better, right? So it literally will put half the sphere there. And then if I go in and scale all these, I can actually just scale them because I believe they're a little bit flatter. So that would be, one semi-completed piece, let's say. And then I can go back into this subtool, append, grab my new layered piece. You can alt click on a subtool, by the way. Let's just turn off the symmetry options here. I'm going to reset the axis and hold shift while rotating, which will give you a nice full rotation. And then I'm just going to scale it proportionally down so it's sort of in the right place. There. Should center that as well. There. By the way, you can also, I only found this out way later in my ZBrush life, you can check the positioning. So if you're off a little bit on X, you can hit 0 and it's going to be nice and centered to the scene or to that center line of the sculpt.